Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I hope you're all well and safe at the moment. You're all most welcome to this 7th session in the Keeping the Dream Alive series by WeTac, My Travel Research and Low Season Traveller. I'd also like to give a special welcome and a shout out to all of our World Tourism Association for Culture and Heritage members and supporters as well. Before we get started, a few general housekeeping rules. Regulars will be well aware of these. You're all on mute to avoid background noise, but please do use the chat function and let us know that you're here. Also do please send in any questions that you've got from today's session via the questions function, which you should see on your GoToWebinar toolbar. And we'll aim to get through as many as we possibly can towards the end after John's finished. All sessions will be recorded and we'll send out links to the recordings shortly after each session. We'll also release the Q&A from each session as a podcast on the Low Season Traveller Insider Guides podcast series, which you can find on iTunes, Spotify, the wetac.org website and other places too. You'll find the entire session with David Tarsh from last Thursday, as well as every other session so far. So as I said, this is the 7th session in a series of 12, where we'll hear from global experts in the fields of marketing and communications, tourism data, aviation, hospitality, and many more. So please do sign up to the whole series and feel free to share the links with your friends and industry colleagues. Finally, we can't provide any of these sessions without the kind support of our partners in this series, so huge thanks to all of the partners, which you'll find listed here. So let me introduce myself first of all. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Jed Brown and I'm the founder of Low Season Traveller and also the managing director in EMEA of the World Tourism Association for Culture and Heritage. And it's my honour to be your moderator for this entire series. And this 7th episode is entitled Aviation in Crisis. It's fair to say that for the most part, tourism starts with airlift. And while many of us aren't directly involved in aviation, we're all too aware that our livelihoods depend on it. Put simply, whatever happens in aviation will affect the rest of the travel and tourism ecostructure further downstream. And as such, this morning's speaker is going to help us to understand exactly how aviation has been affected and what it'll take to cover to previous levels. And there's literally no one better on earth to help us unpick this than today's keynote speaker, John Grant of Midas Aviation. John has worked at the cutting edge of aviation for over 30 years, having spent time with KLM, OAG, ASM, and latterly, of course, with Midas Aviation. He's a hugely well-respected veteran of the industry, regularly provides commentary on the industry for media such as Sky, BBC, and others. And I'm sure he thought he'd seen it all until we hit March this year. Today, John works with airports, tourism boards, airlines, and a variety of other partners in order to help them to attract, retain, I should say, and grow their air services. I guess we used to call it route development, but perhaps it's now known as route protection. I don't know. A very good morning to you, John. Welcome to the Tourism Expert Recovery Series. Great to have you here.
Hi, Jed. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good everything to wherever you are in the world.
Cover off all of the bases. So look, John, great to have you with us, and thank you so much for taking the time out, especially it's early morning there in London, as I know only too well. I'll hand over straight away to you now, and I'll join you again for the Q&A afterwards.
Okay, so I just need the slides to come up. Where have they disappeared? Seem to have disappeared. That's good, isn't it?
That's brilliant. That's a great start, is it? It's too early for the computer.
Well, I'm here, but the slides have disappeared.
Let's see if we can get them back. Sorry about this, everybody. Talk among yourselves, people.
You could ask the first question, which would give us time to find out where these have disappeared to.
Yeah. So, probably one of the first questions that I had is, we're talking about route development there, and I was just sort of saying there at the end that we're talking about maybe it being route protection. Actually, in route development terms, given what you're about to show us in terms of what's happened to the world of aviation, is route development set to be actually in its busiest phase ever in history?
Well, every rule in the book has been unwritten, and everything is now up for grabs. Is a very simple sort of way of describing the situation we now face. The new normal will be completely different to what we've seen in the past, and therefore, you know, as part of that, what we undoubtedly are going to see is airlines renewing and reviewing their networks, and from there, everything, but literally everything, will be under review. Even what we've considered as some of the biggest and safest networks in the world, and routes and city pairs are likely to see change, and that may be a change of aircraft size, or it could be even you know, a route being dropped, because the world has changed, and with that, traffic flows will change, and airlines are going to adjust their networks as much as they can. Can anyone see those, Jed? Can you see those slides at all?
Yes, yep. If you just put it in present mode.
I'm gonna work off this deck then, because that will make it easier, I think. So
Okay.
if you excuse me, I'll go on from here.
Yeah, yep. Okay, so, I'll leave you to it. Thanks, John.
Okay, thank you. So I thought I'd start by posing an interesting question for all of you, really, is have we been working in a market that was growing too quickly? I pulled some data back from 1996, and since then the number of scheduled flights operated has more than doubled. And since 2015 alone, which is only a 4.5 year period, we've seen the number of global seats increase by 25%, primarily off a rapid growth in use of aircraft such as the 737 and the A320 series, particularly in the context of their expanded range through new generation aircraft. And, you know, we were this summer about to see airlines seriously considering transatlantic non-stop regular scheduled services on A320s and 737s. Indeed, WestJet have been doing, or were flying from Halifax to London Gatwick using that aircraft type. But we've not only seen an increase in capacity, we've seen some 35,000 airport pairs were operated in 2019. So one of the great benefits of aviation, as we all know, is its brilliant ability to connect various locations around the world directly. And it's now probably possible to travel from any one place in the world to another point in the world with perhaps just one or at maximum two connections required. So, you know, the phrase "the world is shrinking" is absolutely true. But the question I pose is, had we reached a point where this industry was actually in need of a reset? And if you look on the far right hand side here, the last 3 or 4 years, we have seen rates of growth that have been some of the highest in the last 15 years. Not only have we seen growth in Asia through emergent airlines, the burgeoning Chinese international services, part of a grand master plan from the Chinese airlines to fly to as many destinations as possible. And indeed, I think at one point there was something like 7 or 8 airlines operating from just 1 or 2 markets in China to Melbourne and Sydney. So lots of very fierce competition, but perhaps surprisingly growth in markets that we would have expected to have been quite mature. Rapid growth in the transatlantic market, where we've seen the emergence of long-haul low-cost with carriers such as Norwegian and Level. Obviously, Norwegian's 787 fleet is now grounded and will remain grounded for a indefinite period, at least until 2021. And also in the US domestic market, where suddenly we don't have low-cost carriers, we have ultra low-cost carriers with airlines such as Spirit, Frontier, and Allegiant, who've stimulated more capacity and more growth in the market. And interestingly, we'd also begun to see some of the US legacy airlines with their new fleets expanding seasonal summer flying to Europe and to Latin America as opportunities came along. But was it sustainable? Was this a bubble that we had created on our own that would have burst anyway? And perhaps COVID-19 is a reset moment in time that was going to happen anyway in the aviation industry, and one that we very much needed. And as to why we needed that, well, airline profitability had never been so good. If you look at this data here on the left-hand side, you'll see that for the last 10 years, the airline industry has, at the top level, been extremely profitable. Levels of profit that we've not seen before, returns on capital that we're beginning to be considered as reasonable. But this was the golden moment in an aviation industry that's 100 years old, and it had taken us 90 years to learn the lessons of our business before we actually became quite profitable. But nearly all of that profitability was generated by what I describe as a cluster of airlines: United, American, Delta, and Southwest in North America, the IAG group in Europe, Lufthansa to a lesser degree, Air France and KLM, and then of course Ryanair and EasyJet. And for those in Asia, airlines such as Qantas, Singapore, and Cathay Pacific. Interestingly, no mention there of any Chinese airlines who perhaps have not been as profitable as they would have hoped, particularly on their new long-haul services. Indeed, no new long-haul international service launched by a Chinese airline in the last 5 years has ever made an operating profit. I describe it as land grabbing, as they seek to secure traffic rights and licenses from the Chinese authorities for city pairs that have little chance of being profitable or realistically profitable in the next decade. And only 2 airlines in Africa actually are profitable: Ethiopian and Comair. And Comair, unfortunately, have just had to, in the last couple of weeks, file for protection as their cash reserves had run out. So this is an industry that, whilst profitable and at headline numbers, and as some journalists will frequently say, you know, it's extremely profitable. Yes, it is extremely profitable for a very small community. There are 723 airlines that are sending scheduled services on a weekly basis to OAG. Less than 40, perhaps 50 at most, are consistently profitable over that period of time. And that's based on an operating profit. So that's excluding any types of commercial deals around aircraft sale and lease back, etc. So it's a very fragile community that we live in, and it's very challenging for any airline to make money. So as I say, too much of a good thing. 730 airlines, 10% profitable over an economic cycle. So that's typically an 8 to a 10-year period. The industry has perhaps too much fragmentation. Consolidation was frequently blocked. It's very hard to find an industry of such global scale and size where larger conglomerates have not been established, and this is potentially in most cases down to bilateral issues, state protection, down to cautious strategic thinking around allowing a foreign entity to own a majority share of a carrier in another country. So what we've actually seen is creative ways around this: equity shares in businesses. So Qatar Airways have done a very good job of acquiring shares in carriers around the world. Delta Airlines from the United States have similarly acquired stock in partners around the world, and of course most recently did were usurped at the last moment in South America, where American pulled the rug from under their feet with a new deal with LATAM. So we have too much choice, too much capacity, too many airlines, too little profit, and then suddenly the industry fell perhaps off a cliff. and the view was not particularly good. The 22nd of March will be remembered as a special day in aviation. If it's your birthday on that date, congratulations. But for most of us in the airline industry, it was the beginning of a nightmare. In some 2 weeks, 41 million seats were removed from sale by airlines around the world. 1 week later, 52 million seats had been lost. Over half of the weekly global capacity supplied in the world had disappeared in the space of 3 weeks. We reached a low point around the 4th of May when just under 30 million seats a week were being operated or scheduled to operate. And I say scheduled because, as you'll see later, there was numerous cancellations, some of the highest rates of cancellation that's ever seen in the airline industry during that period. And if
We've lost your sound, John. I think we've lost your sound, John.
hello, can you hear me, Jed?
Can hear you now. Can hear you now. Yep.
Sorry, when did you lose me?
The last thing I had down is that we'd lost 52 million seats in 3 weeks, just at the end of that slide.
Okay, so sorry everyone.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, so we'd lost 52 million seats, which was pretty dramatic. The low point was below 30 million seats a week. It's very good to see both China and US domestic markets remaining relatively strong in terms of capacity, because they literally kept the market afloat on their own. And I've never witnessed such a dramatic supply wipeout as we saw in that short period of time. It was unprecedented. It's probably not the first time I'll use that word today, but it was the biggest single wipeout I have seen. And perhaps the most significant thing about this was it was on a global basis. This was not a regional issue. This was across all regions of the world, whereas in events such as SARS, in events such as MERS and Ebola, we've seen very specific regions impacted. This was a global incident, and everywhere was affected. And just to highlight that, here is some data from OAG, who we do a number of weekly webinars for them, and you can see these are a series of 4 heat maps ranging from the 16th of March through to the 11th of May, and you can see the intensity of the red shaping across those 4 heat maps to a point by the 11th of May last week where 86% of the world's capacity was not operating compared to the same week last year. And there were numerous countries with complete 100% lockdowns on nearly every continent. So, you know, there were some lockdowns occurring in Australia and New Zealand, and talk, of course, about bubbles and corridors and other such creative terminology to reignite air services. We had lockdowns in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia is completely locked down at this moment in time. There are no flights. India was locked down and came out of lockdown last Friday and then went back into lockdown again on Monday of this week. So, you know, that highlights some of the vulnerability of restarting air services and the issues we have to face as an industry. Countries in Europe continue to be in lockdown. South Africa is in lockdown. Peru is in lockdown. There are countries completely isolating themselves from air services at this moment in time. So you can see the spread of the COVID-19 event across the globe. And then moving on. So there are 720 airlines, as I said, that were filing schedules, operating services on the 20th of January of this year. And now we have somewhere around 230 scheduled airlines who are no longer flying and have suspended services. Some of those will return, undoubtedly. EasyJet, Saudi Air, and Turkish Airlines all have schedules loaded and expect to start flying again. Some will return, but perhaps shouldn't. Some of you, I'm sure, have been following the tragedy of South African Airways over the last couple of months, whilst I'm sure all of you are very much aware of Alitalia and the constant resuscitation attempts of Alitalia, who once again are now back in state ownership, when perhaps, given how fierce the Italian market is, they would perhaps be better to be allowed to gracefully exit the market and leave it to others who are able to serve it more effectively and more efficiently. And on the left-hand side here, some friends of ours at a company called Ishka, who are specialists in aviation and aircraft valuations, developed a slide that shows the financial risk profile of airlines against the willingness and the desire of the government stroke shareholders and investors to support those airlines through a COVID-19 event. And as you can see, and as you move across to the top right hand corner of this chart, there are a number of airlines that are in a red box that were identified very early on in this process and in this event as potential candidates at risk. Airlines that either didn't have great cash reserves, or for which there would be little appetite for whatever reasons, be they competition or for just literally strategic government purposes, that there would be little or no support. And I think it's quite interesting on reflection, 18 weeks into this event, that when you look at this table, you see carriers such as Avianca, who are now in Chapter 11, Virgin Atlantic, who are desperately seeking support from their shareholders and have been to the UK government seeking support. Virgin Australia, who I think have 7 or 8 interested parties in refinancing the entity and starting to operate again in a robust manner and provide some competition for Qantas. And South African Airways, who have, as I said, filed Chapter 11. A colleague of mine actually described it as Chapter 88 because they've been in this space 8 times and they've still not sorted out their problems. And then other carriers slightly more to the left, such as Norwegian, who, as we know, have now sought and secured agreement to operate with just 7 Boeing 737s for the rest of 2020 and into early 2021. And this was an airline that was one of the fastest growing and most successful carriers in terms of growth and passengers carried in the last 5 years. And then carriers such as El Al over here, who yesterday announced or raised the question whether they actually had a sustainable business after this moment in time, and would they be able to survive. So it gives you an idea of where you are, and if any of these are any of your customers, on your suppliers. You know, it's good to know that if you're in the bottom left-hand corner, those carriers are quite well protected. The further out you go, of course, the greater the risk becomes. So if I refer to just, you know, a couple of these carriers as we go forward, you'll see the challenges that they have as they try to grow out from this situation. So looking at bailouts, support, investment and rescue, it is quite interesting to look and see how much government support everyone has provided from their respective authorities towards their national airlines. And very early on, Singapore Airlines, as you can see here, through the Singapore government, secured access to a new financing package. Now, it's important to caveat this information with the knowledge that each and every one of these commercial agreements, each and every one of these loan guarantees, financing and repackaging is very, very different, because as you would appreciate, some are just loan guarantees, some are direct investment, and some are refinancing. So no two deals are the same. But if you look on the vertical axis, you can see the amount of funding that was requested or has been approved. So in the case of Singapore Airlines, nearly $14 billion of funding or access to funds as required. And then if you look here, you can see United, Delta and American, and you compare that to the amount of seats. So you can see that on a per seat basis operated, the relative support provided to carriers such as American and Delta Airlines and United is quite small. And then you look at the amount of revenue per seat that has been given to Singapore Airlines, very, very much larger. And in this bottom left-hand quadrant here, we've blown that out so you can see all of the other airlines that have received.
We can't hear you, John. I don't know if you can hear me. We've just lost your sound again there. Sorry about this, everyone. We'll try and get the sound back on John again. John. We'll try and get his attention. Please bear with us. Apologies for this, everybody.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now, John. We lost you on the slide when you were showing the consolidated amount of the airlines that basically weren't getting the support. So you just talked us through about the ones which were getting the support, and then you just sort of shown us in that bottom the bottom left corner how that's been extrapolated out, and these are the ones that really weren't looking like they were getting much in the way of support. We just lost you at that point.
Okay.
Yep, thanks.
Sorry, folks. Early in London, no idea what's going on here. So moving on to this slide here, which looks at some of the messaging that we've seen from IATA in the last couple of weeks. I think this is fascinating. I remember going to do a BBC news interview on the 5th of March to discuss an industry expected revenue loss of 63 billion at the bottom end of a spectrum, and I think it was 113 was their mid-range expectation, and everyone was in shock about how large these numbers could be. Within 3 weeks, IATA were forecasting a 252 billion revenue loss for the industry. By the 7th of April, they were saying 25 million jobs were at risk. By the 14th of April, the industry's trade association was expecting a loss of about $314 billion. And then a week later, IATA put out a press release saying that the industry was going to have to refund in the region of $10 billion to passengers, which may explain both why there has been a reluctance in some parts of the world for those refunds to be processed, or to be processed as quickly as perhaps the traveller would want, and at the same time why it has been, the airline's preference to offer vouchers that could be considered for travel in the next 12 months. To give you an insight into that, every refund that is undertaken by an airline takes around 15 minutes for a very simple point-to-point refund to be processed. So for a very simple ticket. But if they're refunding a ticket that has been half used, they have to calculate how much is actually owed back to the passenger. They have to net off the taxes and the airport fees and the charges. And if it involves a routing with another airline, then that's an even more complex refund. So a classic interline ticket would take a lot longer than 15 minutes to be processed. Airlines were never set up to refund volumes to the scale that they are now being asked to do. And airlines are in the same position as many other businesses in that they have furloughed staff, they have had to cut back their resources, and therefore they are struggling to just keep up to pace with the amount of refunds. There is one airline, just as an example, in the United Kingdom, where although they are obliged to refund to travel agents within 14 working days, it's taking them up to 100 days at the moment to refund that cash. So on that basis, we just have this horrible sticky situation, which of course brings more doubt and question to the whole industry in the minds of the consumer. But this is just the revenue side, and of course from the airline perspective, there's also the cost side, and a major part of that, as we've known for many years, has been about the price of oil, and particularly how vulnerable airlines are to significant swings in the price of oil. Now, one of the good things for many people in the whole COVID-19 event has been the significant fall in the price of oil. But it's proving to be a very slippery slope for many airlines. As you may be aware, it's quite customary for airlines to hedge their fuel price, so essentially buy forward at an agreed price for an agreed volume of oil from suppliers around the world. And that obviously gives, in normal times, the airlines reassurance that they can work through and plan with one of their major cost items fixed. Unfortunately, the price of oil has collapsed from about $80 a barrel $88 a barrel in January, down to, at the moment, around $33, $34 a barrel. But many airlines have hedged at prices ranging from about 89 in the case of EasyJet, down to 63, 64 with Lufthansa, and large proportions of their anticipated fuel supplies is locked in at these prices for the rest of this year, and in one case through into 2021. From the recent quarterly reports we've seen from airlines, we know that for the IAG group, so British Airways, Iberia, Aer Lingus, and Vueling, that fuel hedge cost them $300 million in the first quarter of this year. So if they had purchased at the market price, as opposed to what was their hedge price, they would have saved $300 million. Ryanair use a phrase called an ineffective hedge, and announced yesterday that that had cost them $382 million US. Singapore Airlines on last Friday announced that their fuel hedge had cost them $498 million. The collapse of global trade, the glut of oil, has created a double whammy for many airlines, committed to purchasing fuel that they're not using at a price that is significantly above the market level. It's created a situation where cash continues to drain from these businesses with no solution and no way of recovering that situation. The good news is that we seem to have reached the bottom. If I look at the weekly capacity trend through to the end of November, you can see that we had a very, very rapid decline in capacity over that 5-week period. And we've been bumping along here. This slight increase in capacity here is a function of the Chinese domestic market and more capacity being added back up. But the real problem now is the shaded yellow area. And how do we get out from COVID-19? This, for the industry, represents a real challenge and a real problem. This savage reduction in capacity, whilst extremely expensive, damaging, impactful, was immediate. This poses a much longer term issue and problem that we need to address as an industry. Very bluntly, it was easy to dive in, but it's very difficult to crawl back out. Adding back capacity is going to be very challenging for all airlines around the globe. Reopening schedules generally requires a booking lead time. If you think about any new route, any airline that has announced a new service, they will at the minimum be announcing that service perhaps 3 to 5 months before the first scheduled service takes off. Many airlines are trying to build back capacity with less than 2 or 3 weeks notice. Current forward bookings in their reservation systems are almost non-existent. Less than 20% of the previous year's levels for most months of this summer season. And if you think about when COVID-19 started, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, January, February, March, and April are 3 of the most important booking months for the holiday season. And at the time when airlines are looking forward to rebuilding their cash reserves, looking forward to
Apologies there, everybody. I think we appear to have lost John again to the gremlins. Hopefully he'll see Carolyn's brilliant sign, very high-tech way of communicating that we've got, to see if we can get John's attention, just to let him know that we've lost his sound. Many apologies for this, everybody. Please just do bear with us while we try and get the sound back. I think this could be just one of those little challenges that we're going through.
I suspect the problem may be, Jed, that he's lost audio totally, so he can't hear you and I speaking to him either.
Yeah.
So
I'll resort to WhatsApp. Apologies, everybody. We've just texted John to let him know he's probably just talking on, giving all kinds of great information, and nobody can hear him. Apologies for this. Fascinating stuff, though, as we're sort of going through this and understanding a little bit more about what the challenges are that the industry is going through.
I'm going to keep the side up, Chris, until we get some message to John. So please excuse me for staying here, people, but I will be on silent.
If everybody in the meantime, if you could be putting through your questions, we've had some great questions coming through from Enzo, Dale, and Mark, which we'll absolutely be putting through to John. Talking about one of the things we want to talk about is, is it right to be bailing out the airlines, or is that falsely supporting the airlines, which is what, as an industry, we seem to have been doing from John's presentation for the past at least 10 years. Is it right to try and do that again in order to return to normality, or should we be looking at a new way of running things? Is it right to support the likes of Virgin Atlantic? British Airways and IAG Group have come out and said that the government shouldn't support these failing carriers. They're failing for a reason. But at the other end of that route, obviously you've got, for Virgin, they serve an awful lot of Florida and the Caribbean, and an awful lot of tourism businesses will be massively affected as a result if Virgin were to go under. So is it right? Is it the right thing to do that we support these airlines? So these are the kind of issues that we'd like to touch on when we get through to the Q&A. So we'll just see if we can get John. I've sent him a text. Chris has sent him a text.
Hello, Jed, can you hear me?
Oh, we can hear you now. We can hear you now. We just lost you at the end of the last slide that you were on, John.
Right, okay. I'm going to switch to my build so that we're going to avoid. Can you hear me, Jed?
Yeah, yep, can still hear you.
Okay. Right, sorry, guys. So, as I say, this slide shows Wizz Air's ambitious plans for air service that they launched in early May. They put back in 400,000 seats a week, very brave, very early, preemptive, before much of Europe was out of lockdown. Most travellers still didn't know about what travel requirements and processes they would need to fulfill to be able to sit on an aircraft. But in the first week of service, they cancelled nearly 90% of those flights because there was just no demand, because people were struggling to work their way through the processes and understand what was required of them to travel. And consequently, you can see that a week later, they had cut their network, their planned number of flights to around 180 a week, whereas previously they had been planning to operate 600 plus flights a week. So there is a real danger as we come out of this event around the whole rebuild and matching capacity to demand. It's going to be a challenge for many. And to that point, these recovery strategies that we see from the airlines have to be based around building and aligning demand with capacity. So here's an example of some analysis that we've undertaken that compares the number of bookings currently held in the GDS systems by major airlines and by country markets against the amount of seats that are still planned to be operated in July
of 2020. And essentially what we're trying to determine here is, are we likely to see more cancellations from airlines? Are we going to see further adjustments to their schedules in the coming weeks ahead of July 2020 as they begin to balance capacity against demand and booking activity? Now, in every market, with the notable exception of Hong Kong, Japan, we tracked both capacity change and booking change. And essentially, if you are below this yellow line here, and you are in this area here, there is more capacity relative to booking activity than there was this time last year. So all of these markets that you see here are likely to see capacity being cut by airlines in the next couple of weeks as they begin to focus on July and fixing their schedules relative to demand. Now, obviously, many parts of the world are still in lockdown, and until that central issue is resolved, you know, big announcements from Lufthansa about we are flying again in June of this year, big announcements from Delta that they're going to add 100 international flights, are worthy sentiments, but it's going to be really difficult for people to book, and we should expect to see short-term cancellations in many markets as we work our way through the summer season towards the end of October. Which brings me on to, what do we need? Well, we need, I think, what we call the 3 C's to recovery. We need clarity. One of the great frustrations is a lack of direction from government agencies and trade associations. Airlines are looking for leadership to understand what processes they need to adhere to. Airports are looking to understand from health authorities what requirements they have to be adhering to and putting in place. And we understand it's not going to be until the end of May before ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, publish their definitive guidelines on what steps and processes need to be put in place on a global basis. Some of you may have seen governments backtracking on travel requirements. We have a wonderful example in the United Kingdom where we were advised informally, I mean informally by the government, that there would be a quarantine process put in place at some point for travellers returning to the UK. There isn't one now, but it will be put in place. That doesn't make sense in itself. But we were told that France would be excluded from that quarantine zone. We've subsequently been told that France will be included in that quarantine zone. For an airline trying to run a business and rebuild a business, that confusion creates all sorts of uncertainty. We don't need cheap photo shots of people on arrival being tested for COVID-19. You know, pictures of 10 people in a vast hall, all socially distancing and being tested are great, but the reality is that, you know, we cannot just process 10 people. Airports process thousands of people. We also need to rebuild confidence. There's been so much hysteria about the middle seat and keeping it free. It is only 17 inches wide, that middle seat, on most aircraft types and seating configurations. If it's empty or it's full, then I think, you know, it just defeats the whole argument of social distancing. Truth is, we will not require that seat for quite some time on the vast majority of flights because demand will be quite low. And we need to begin to highlight the positive messages about forward booking demands, growth, new routes being started, capacity being added back, etc. So we've got to rebuild confidence in the whole travel community. And And then I think we've got to be cautious as well about capacity. Too much capacity too quickly could be extremely damaging. Rapid capacity rebuild will absolutely impact yields. There is a big difference between creating and stimulating markets and having too much capacity in a market. Airlines will stimulate markets when they begin to fly again. They will put some very attractive fares in the market. They need to build cash again. It's important for them. But too much capacity too quickly will just undermine many, particularly when we have some airlines that have received state aid and benefits and support and others who have not. We have created a very uneven playing field from a competition perspective. And the last thing we need to see is those airlines that received significant support and funding using that cash as a way to stimulate and develop new business, but at the same time put below cost pricing into the market. So when will the industry recover? Well, it might never. If you believe some people, they'll tell you that traveller confidence has been completely shattered. There are alternate modes of transport which are becoming more acceptable to some, such as high-speed train, and we have evidence in China that would say over the last public holiday there was greater use of high-speed train and private cars rather than air services. So that might be something we need to consider. There is a fear of being stranded in another COVID event amongst some communities. For some people, of course, who've been furloughed or made redundant, their savings have been destroyed in the last 3 months, and they're now looking at rebuilding those before travel is even on their agenda. And of course, video conferencing, except today, meets my and most people's business needs. There's equally a group that say until there is a vaccine, I'm staying at home. Or there are others who say I want to see more of the world, I've missed it. Flying will be cheaper and safer than ever. A colleague of mine said the safest place in the world at the moment is an airport because there is no one there. And that's very true. People who have been in a fortunate position can say they've spent very little being stuck at home, so they're going to splash the cash. Others will say, I need to catch up with my friends who I've been videoing with regularly. And for some businesses, they may well say there's lots of opportunity out there. Everything is possible in the new normal. It's the unknown. But for what it's worth, here's some thoughts from me. Global capacity will probably have recovered to around 60% of its previous levels by January 21. So the beginning of next year. But load factors will be between 15 and 20% lower on that level of capacity. So we will still be seeing more capacity than there will be demand through to January 21. By summer 21, global capacity will have recovered to around 75% of its previous levels, but we will still have that load factor lag, somewhere between 10 and 15%. And by April of 2022, so 2 years from now, 90% of the COVID capacity, pre-COVID capacity will have returned, but we'll still see load factors lagging behind. And even from April 2022, airline cash reserves will require rebuilding. And that's going to take another 2 to 3 years to reach the point that they were at before. And I think worryingly, some airlines will not make it past February 21. There is no doubt about that. If they cannot build cash reserves this summer and quickly, then the prognosis for some airlines is for failure and collapse in the first quarter of next year. So it's a fascinating experiment that we have lived through in terms of aviation. But we now are in a situation where we need to rebuild. Jed, are you there?
I am indeed. Thank you, John. Come and join me up here, John. Not at all. Not at all. Thank you so much. That was there's a lot to unpick there, and it was look, that was fascinating. I mean, one of the sort of the themes that we've seen there is, I think we're saying that the aviation industry, for the most part, has been, in many cases, falsely inflated for quite some time, right? And are we just paying the price of the fact that it has been falsely inflated for so long?
It was a great It was certainly a great market as a traveller in terms of available capacity and supply. And we had probably created artificial markets that, just from a realistic long-term perspective, were unsustainable. When you look at an airline's network and you list all of the destinations, there will always be at the bottom of that list maybe 5 or 10% that the airline is focused on and is at risk. And we had allowed that to grow and grow. The leasing of aircraft became relatively cheap. The barriers to entry were almost non-existent in this globalized world. It has been relatively easy to start an airline. And on that basis, what we've seen, of course, is new airlines, new entrants, all of these sort of things. So we've seen probably too many people, too many airlines, too much capacity, and yeah, we've probably been spoiled, and the world has changed a bit, I think.
Do you think, though, that there's an expectation, both within the industry and actually with the consumers as well, that we need to be working to return back to those old days? Which, what we're saying is that as a result of COVID, it's been exposed for what it is. Having false route economics, as well as I suppose a false sense of security with regards to the travel industry. Is it right for us to aspire to get back to that, or should we actually be looking at a new world order of aviation? Is it right to be bailing out it's linked to one of the questions, and we'll move on to the listeners' questions. Is it right to be bailing out the likes of Virgin Atlantic? Because you sort of think, well, if they're not profitable and they're going to go bust, then that's the capitalist world that we live in. That's what happens. But of course, there is the other side of this, which is, for example, the Caribbean. That's going to massively affect their tourism economies as a result of this. Is it right that we keep supporting these airlines which are failing, and they're failing for good reason?
Well, there's a load of questions there. If you were restarting the airline industry, you wouldn't start it from where we are today, in terms of a mix of public and private owned entities competing quite often against each other in the same markets. It makes for unfair competition on occasions. The issue about whether we should be bailing those airlines out is absolutely central to the situation we face at the moment. And my personal opinion is that we shouldn't be bailing them out. They should have behaved like good businesses, respecting shareholders, building up cash reserves. They shouldn't have been doing things that strategically, everyone looked at it and said, why on earth are you trying to do this, or why are you doing that? And we shouldn't be picking on Virgin Atlantic in this discussion. Why on earth did you suddenly start Virgin, Little Red, or whatever it was, their UK domestic network, paying a huge lease price to Aer Lingus when everyone knew that you would never compete against British Airways frequent flyer program and the brand loyalty that BA had on the domestic trunk routes? Absolutely stupid, absolutely poor decision by that business. Why did they fly a very fragmented long-haul network? The clue was in their original name, Virgin Atlantic, that's where they should have stuck to. That was their strength. That's where their brand existed. But there are airlines that you could do create exactly the same discussion around. Thai International at the moment are heading into bankruptcy, from what I can see, and they've been saved many times. So I think for many airlines, Jed, they confused being cash generative with being profitable. And that is a very, very big difference. And many have been slow to respond to the changing world in which we live in. Ancillary revenue incomes have been, for many airlines, still not developed, and they could have. So there's a lot of things that are wrong in the industry that this gives an opportunity to sort out.
One of the sort of the points on this that that came across from your presentation, and we've heard it from a few different sources now, is look, when we come out of this, it's pretty certain there are going to be fewer commercial airlines in the world as a result of this. Do you foresee that is going to have an impact on the prices for flights? That I know at the end there you were sort of saying prices could come down, people might want to travel more than ever. If there's going to be fewer airlines around, is that an opportunity for those airlines to increase the prices accordingly?
Well, I think one of the great challenges we have, Jed, is that, as I just mentioned, the barriers to entry are much lower than they used to be. So if we see demand picking up, there's probably thousands of aircraft around the world that will be sitting on pieces of tarmac somewhere that have not been put back into service by existing airlines that will be available for new carriers. So I can see a situation where we will see failures, we will see airline collapses in the next couple of months, and stretching into early next year, because they will not have built the cash reserves up. But there will be other entrepreneurs out there with liquidity and with cash who will see an opportunity to start new airlines with no debt attached to that entity, and with lease rates currently 30 to 40% below what they have been at the beginning of the year. This is a supply and demand market, and as demand rebuilds, those airlines who've run out of cash reserves may well collapse, but there is equally a high possibility that we will see some new entrants enter the market. And we may actually see some changes in ownership. So we see people who previously could not start an airline in an overseas country being invited to start that airline.
There could be some quite interesting opportunities. This was linked to some of our questions. I'll start moving on to some of our questions here. As you can see, I'm on a very small screen, so I'm having to squint. Apologies for that. Let me get our first question, which was Enzo Zangrilli from Italy. Good morning, guys. John, Jed, a comment, please, on your Prime Minister's 14-day quarantine. Is it still on? Is it not something totally dissonant from any other country's decision on the subject? This 14-day quarantine period, you touched on it in your presentation, John. This is for the UK have. I'm not familiar with what's going on with Australia and New Zealand, although I think there will be similar kind of quarantines. But we, as you were pointed out there, John, we were told that France was excluded from the quarantine. I think the latest is that the Republic of Ireland has been excluded from the quarantine, which presumably means that you could fly out on your vacation, assuming you're able to, out of Dublin, come back from Dublin, hop over on Ryanair to Manchester or London, and you wouldn't have to be in quarantine. Is that about the height of it?
Yeah, that is about the height of it.
Okay.
To answer Enzo's question, I mean, it's as bad an idea as his piano playing is, but that's
Oh, come on, his piano playing is very good.
But I think it just, if you are an airline CEO and you are sitting in your office trying to plan your way out of this event, and you either fly from the United Kingdom or fly to the United Kingdom, and it's a large part of your network. 2 weeks ago, you were told that, or 10 days ago, you were told that there would be a quarantine. 24 hours after that, you were told that the Republic of Ireland and France would be excluded from that. And yesterday, some government minister said, well, we might actually have some selected countries that we would have corridors where travel would be permitted. How can you plan your business on that basis? How can you put schedules and services back in to operate? It is by any stretch of the imagination an unworkable strategy. And there are two people who I have the utmost respect for from either end of the aviation spectrum: Michael O'Leary at Ryanair and Willie Walsh from IAG. And it might just be their country of origin, but they tell it as they see it. And Michael O'Leary said you couldn't even police such a policy in the United Kingdom because you do not have enough government officials to check on whether people are adhering to the quarantine requirements that are going to be put in place. It is incomprehensible. And for an island that is dependent on air service and was in the top 5 global markets for capacity, to have a quarantine requirement is just madness. We don't have one now. Why would we have one when everyone else is building out?
Well, I think that they're unpoliced as well, aren't they? I think it's you're asked to go into quarantine. So I know early on in the crisis, there's a few countries which had this, which you were asked to go into quarantine, and I think New Zealand, Australia, they were all there. I have access to a lot of the forward keys data, and I was seeing that there were still trips that are being booked, and they're still being booked today. Just so everybody knows, there are still passengers on flights, and people were booking trips for New York to London for 3 days. Returning 3 days later. Well, obviously they're not going to quarantine themselves for 14 days when they're only over for 3 days to begin with. So it's
absolutely not. And a one-day business trip to Spain at the moment for a UK or a Spanish national would require a 28-day quarantine period.
It's just ridiculous.
14 days at either end of the route to complete one day's business. It just goes to show the lack of understanding amongst politicians about the importance of air service and how the market works. And these are apparently our elected representatives. It drives me to distraction.
It needs a reality check. Sorry, John, could I just ask you? I've just realised. Could you turn on your camera just so we can see you? I hadn't realised you weren't on camera. Yeah, sorry. Thanks.
Yeah, there you go.
There you go. Oh, thanks, John. Another point on, and again, we sort of touched on this, and I listened to a podcast recently, and I'm sure people listen to different podcasts all the time, about what the future of aviation will be like in terms of the airport experience. So obviously after 9/11, we had the formation of the TSA, we've got all of the security and the extra security checks, and there's been sort of murmurs now about, before you even go on the airport grounds, you're going to have to be, tested for COVID-19 and all of this kind of stuff, and social distancing. So a couple of points I just want to unpick on that. Social distancing at the moment, we're being told that you need to be 2 meters away from anybody else. That requires an individual footprint of 16 meters squared. Are there any airports in the world that are big enough for that? Is this even the social distancing, is this just unrealistic completely for aviation to be able to have this social distancing?
Completely unrealistic. I mean, take any major airport that has a series of wide-bodied aircraft departing within a 1 hour or a 2 hour window, and have reasonably high load factors, 50% plus. Then we're going to have queuing in excess of a mile and a half, I think was Heathrow's estimation. And it's just not going to work. It's just like, please think about the whole situation. There are so many ironies around all of this. At a time when the industry is contracting, when we're seeing less capacity, less passengers, we're actually imposing on airports a requirement to create more space and to distance people more than they ever have been before. And I completely and utterly understand the sentiment, but the practicalities of it are just not possible. And maybe it is about this confidence and reassurance. Do we put sanitizing hand wash dispensers by every air bridge, so that once a person's got to that point in the process, they can wash their hands again cleanse themselves that way. No, it's not possible. There isn't an airport in the world that is going to be able to cope with that requirement, Jed.
Yeah, we're just going to have to accept that there is a risk.
Yeah, we are, but we've got to put this in context. You know, if you look at, I mean, in my own area, if you look at the population around where I live, and you look at the number of incidences of COVID-19, and we would consider ourselves a normal type of community with a normal demographic. You know, we're talking about 0.0024% of people that have been impacted, and you know, as every government minister tells me, a death is, you know, an unfortunate incident. I completely get that, but the death of a global economy, and it's all about risk, isn't it? And I think we've got to get beyond that point and start to rebuild confidence.
Absolutely. Another question here. I think we've pretty much covered it, but I'll read it out. This was from Mark Taylor. Not sure if John will get to this. If Virgin are bailed out, will the updated carrier be more likely to join one of the global alliances?
Well, if Virgin gets bailed out, well, Virgin are quasi in an alliance anyway, aren't they? You know, they are part of SkyTeam through their Delta ownership, and they do many things that are consistent with what Delta would want them to do, rather than what perhaps Virgin would want to do themselves. As I understand it, all of their back office systems are now Delta's. You know, who calls the shots on the slots at Heathrow? I'm sure Delta have a considerable influence on that. The value of Virgin Atlantic is not in the brand, you know, because in the last 3 months, their reputation has been shot in the UK. Public goodwill has been, you know, severely flowing against them. It's in those slots that they have at Heathrow. And 4 months ago, they were trading at about $20 million a pair. Now they're probably not even a third of that value until the uncertainty is removed from the market. But over time, that value will rebuild, and they've got the historic rights. So that the value of the Virgin Atlantic business is in the slots rather than the brand. And you know, someone asked me, would Virgin survive? And I said, I really don't know. All I can tell you is the capacity will be there. You know, if they are not there, someone will come
fill it.
Yeah.
This was from Dale Lawrence. In the 2016 at the Party Conference in Auckland, John predicted the demise of the A380. We were talking about this off there before. Are other aircraft types now at risk of imminent obsolescence? So I suppose this comes on to this point. There's, you know, when we're looking at a new world like this in terms of aviation, you know, where are the opportunities and threats for the different aircraft types as well?
Well, if you're a fan of a 747-400 and you can find a flight that's still scheduled and you want to do it quickly, because it's not going to be around for much longer.
Really?
Yeah, the 747-400 series was already becoming quite a rare beast. Lufthansa had a fleet, and British Airways have got a fleet, and there are a couple of other carriers out there with some. But you know, I can see that being retired. Many airlines like BA and Lufthansa already had publicly announced the retirement schedules for those fleets. They're going to be accelerated forward. They're not going to come back. So that's definitely a goner. Americans got rid of the MD-80, and you know, that's not going to come back. Certainly not for American. And probably Delta's made some plans around a 767, so that's not going to be around in their fleet. All of which plays to that point I was making earlier. There's going to be a lot of spare aircraft around, that if someone sees a gap in the market and has no debt, and you know, can start from scratch and can build a new business model and doesn't have to worry about pensions and all of the things that many airlines are burdened with at this moment in time, it could strangely enough be a good time to think about a new airline. But you know, and even Tim Clark at Emirates has said, you know, the A380 is history. Dal, I was right. You know, sadly it's not the right aircraft for the right time.
Yeah. That's a shame. Will Emirates, this is from Andrew Denishensky, will Emirates and Qatar be looking at a similar setup to the Emirates Qantas partnership, which effectively bailed out Qantas? Is this essentially what BA have in place with Qatar?
I think there is. If you look at the Emirates network and you look at Dubai and what has happened there over the last 40 years, it's been a phenomenal success story. You know, the creation of a mega city out of the desert and all the visionary plans that they have delivered on. But within the UAE, I think the question is, does the market need 2 national carriers or even 3 national carriers if you include Sharjah? Within the United Arab Emirates, no, it probably doesn't. Does it need 3 major airfields within a 1-hour drive time of each other, 2 of which have little or minimal use, and that's DWC and Abu Dhabi? The answer is no, they probably don't. Would they be better with 1 merged entity? Yes. Why has it not happened? That's a thing called pride that has prevented it from happening. But you know, if you were going to do it, now would be a good time to do it. And I think, you know, Qatar have got their own challenges where they are.
Will the potential, this one's from Mark Taylor, will the potential passenger concerns re health and increased time spent in airports lead to increased use of private jets and perhaps also increase in demand for flights out of smaller airports such as London City?
That's a good question. Private jet movements over the last couple of weeks have been significantly up on previous years. You know, and there's a growing awareness that they can be quite price competitive. Use of secondary airports depends on what the government requirements are on screening processes, you know, and whether those airports continue to survive. In the United Kingdom, there are many regional airports that are, you know, now with the demise of Flybe, which occurred before COVID-19 had really started, many of those airports were 90% plus dependent on Flybe for their aeronautical revenues, and that's not been replaced. And we've lived without those services for 3.5 months. And it's going to be harder for those services to be restarted after a gap of that amount of time. I know we've been in lockdown, but people will just either turn to the train or perhaps even take private car. So I think it's a really interesting dynamic that we have playing out at this moment in time.
Yep. Chris, Carolyn, do you want to come on? Have you got any questions from your side? Hey. Chris, did you have any questions that came through on your side?
Well, one of the things that was when I was listening to John and just some of the sort of the dynamics that are happening or the confusion that's happening within the industry. There are so many small things that need to be considered. I mean, what happens with boarding passes and e-tickets? Is everything on your phone from now on?
I think so.
You can't be passing these on anymore. Yeah, it has to be, doesn't it, John?
I think so, Chris. I think biometrics are going to be a fascinating area of development. Yeah. You know, your own personal passport. There was been speculation about, you know, inserting a microchip under your skin that's got all your sort of personal details in your bank account, passport, etc., etc. All potential solutions. I mean, this will accelerate the automation of travel, no doubt about that. Be that from, you know, just baggage drop-off facilities through to clearing, security, boarding. You know, you can imagine a situation where for those who are lucky enough or unlucky enough still to get fed on an aeroplane, someone heats your meal up in a kitchen, puts it in a box, and you go and you get a message comes up on your IFE screen that tells you your meal's ready to go and pick up at the catering booth. You know, because all of that personality and all of those touch points apparently are going to be removed or could be removed. What I would say is that as human beings, we forget things very quickly. You know, the hysteria, the natural reaction to 911 was of concern. Everyone moved past that within about 6 months. Typically, the industry bounces back between 9 and 12 months later. You look at the curve and it's where it would have been. This might take a bit longer.
It's quite interesting. You know, I was looking at those timelines that you were talking about. You know, 2021, 22, etc. And on the presentation that I made a couple of weeks ago, I was referring back to SARS, 2003, and of course SARS lasted for what, 2 months, less than 800 deaths, and yet it took the industry, the aviation industry, about a year to recover. So the reality of all of this, and then of course factoring into this equation the work that ICAO has to do in terms of policy and the various different practices, this is a bloody minefield. You know, it's muddling through is one way to describe it right now, but it's so confused.
Completely, and you know, even at just so many levels, there are many flight deck crew that, if we are not careful, will, under current rules and regulations, need to revalidate before they can actually operate a commercial flight. Unless someone issues dispensations, you know, everyone from cabin staff to flight deck are going to have to do familiarization flights, and you can't do them all in a simulator. You've got to do them in an aircraft, and if you're going to do them in an aircraft, these airlines are going to have to spend more money getting their people back up to speed. Now, the UKCAA, I understand, has issued a dispensation, but you know, that's got to be done on a global basis. And there are airfields in the world where, you know, because of their peculiarities and operating restrictions, some flight decks need to fly regularly to maintain their license for that airport. So we've got things at that very simple level that need to be put back in place. Air traffic controllers, you know, they've all been furloughed. We've got to find them and get them back on working as well.
Gonna take a while.
It hadn't crossed my mind before, John, but you know, when you look at COVID-19 and the incubation period, you know, they say it's 2 weeks. In fact, they now know that it can live in the nose for probably up to 3 weeks. Just looking at the social distancing of a tech crew in a cockpit, how's that going to work? It's, you know, it's really quite amazing. You can test one person one day, and the following day they could be positive.
Absolutely, absolutely. Which, Chris, which interestingly was the first response from the UK government's chief medical officer when quizzed on that particular point. Said there is no value in airport screening because someone could walk through with a clean bill of health and not present symptoms for another 13 days. But now the chief medical officer and our elected representatives are saying that we now need to have quarantine. How do you square that circle?
Yeah, you can't, can you? It's I think a lot of it, you know, you alluded to it before, John. It's just going to be about the perception of it, and it's just about you know, I think a lot of it seems to be that, you know, people are just going to have to feel more secure and safe. But like you say, there isn't an insurance policy in the world that's going to cover anybody for anything to do with coronavirus or any strain of a coronavirus ever again. Therefore, I think there's just going to have to be an acceptance across everybody that there is a risk, hopefully quite a small risk, but there is a risk. But you can't avoid it. And like they say, you know, we've been living with coronaviruses, strains of it, for at the very least 17 years. So you know, I guess it's just going to be a part of the new normal, new abnormal, whatever we want to call it.
Yeah, and we'll get past it. The industry does. It's amazingly. If other industries showed the amount of resilience and creativity that the aviation sector showed, you know, the world would be in a pretty good place.
Yeah. Did you want to say something, Caroline?
I did, but I suspect it might throw a cat among the pigeons, which is I think a number of epidemiologists might well disagree with you. And we've actually had a calculation done of the benefit of the lockdown to the Australian economy, taking into account both the losses and the gains. And we're $20 billion better off for having a lockdown, which is a pretty unarguable number. So I don't pretend to understand all the detail myself, but I think when you say it's unarguable, I would like to just say, well, maybe we need more than one kind of opinion on that. And we're all from an aviation background. We look at it through the lens of our world and our space. Australia and New Zealand do have lockdowns. We need permission to fly overseas, and you must self-quarantine for 2 weeks if you come here. It's not been 100% effective, but it's been widely supported and widely used. So I think we probably do need to be aware there's a wider dialogue that we sit within on that. And I'd be really interested to have views in the chat box from other people on what their thoughts are on some of that. And I think one of the things that's confused people around this is probabilities, which is any individual measure on its own looks stupid, but every measure that's been recommended or taken has been looked on playing the percentages. So it's incredibly stupid that 20 people can go, 30 people can go to a funeral here in Australia, but only 10 people can get together for anything else. But when you look at the percentages of that and set it against the emotional impact of someone being able to attend a funeral, you can see why that apparent inconsistency sets up. So I'm just playing a little bit of devil's advocate here, I guess, for a moment.
It's good to have a devil in the room, but yeah, and you know what you're saying is right, and everything should be considered in a rounded context. And the biggest, you know, I empathise with people in many respects because we're dealing with an unknown, aren't we? Whereas when there's a terrorist attack, you know, it's a horrible situation and it's an event, but people can respond in a particular way and authorities can respond in a particular way because they have seen that type of event before and know how to handle it. Whereas this is an unknown, but it's the consistency of messaging, not just in one country, but across countries, that is very, very important to maintain confidence, not just in aviation, but just confidence in society.
I suspect that's part of the reason why it may have worked better in Australia and New Zealand than it did in the UK, John, is that there were two changes in that message. One, when only flights from China were set off, and then the second was that everyone was self-quarantine at one time, and that has remained in place. So it hasn't been, I think that's where we see it. But I think you've definitely got a lot of support from people in the room. In fact, one of the questions was around, I'm just clicking down to have a look at it now, was how do we knock some sense into the politicians?
Good question. We don't. I mean, what frustrates me more than anything, I think, is the woeful response of the industry's trade associations in all parts of the world, from IATA to ICAO to you know, the Airport Operators Association in the United Kingdom, whoever it happens to be, PARTA, whoever it happens to be. Sorry, Dow. You know, just there is, God, we've lacked leadership. God, we've lacked anyone, you know, taking the initiative and trying to bring people together and get a consensus. This thing happened 3.5 months, 4 months ago, and ICAO is still working out what its guidelines are going to be. You know, what did they do for the first 7 or 8 weeks of this event? Watch it, wonder what was going on, you know, self-isolate at home. You know, it just, and some of the sound bites from IATA, you think you need to, unless they're doing really good lobbying behind the scenes, in which case it's not working. You know, it's just let us all down so badly.
Another question we've had, John, and this has come up on a few previous webinars, but I think it may be easier for you to answer this than some of the previous speakers, which is the whole issue of airfares and what's going to happen to airfares going forward if we are having to fly at these kind of capacity levels on aircraft.
Well, at the moment, when we look at forward booking data, so there's lots of companies, Skyscanner, Forward Keys, 3 Victors, who have who track forward fares and movements in fares. We're seeing no movement in fares whatsoever, either up or down. Now, in truth, they don't have much scope to go down, particularly in Europe when you factor in airport charges and you factor in you know, environmental taxes and all of the other taxes. The net fare to the airline sometimes are no more than 10 or 12 pounds in Europe, and they make more of their revenue from ancillaries. Jet2's ancillary revenue per passenger last year was about 37 pounds, which is more than their average yield. So, you know, what we are seeing is airlines waiving restrictions. So, you know, whereas previously you bought a relatively cheap fare, you couldn't change your flight, whatever, you've now got flexibility to do that. I've heard that, you know, it's if you buy a fare on Delta and American for January at a really cheap fare and you manage to change a reservation and go in July when it's normally the high season, lucky you. But of course, airlines are trying to generate cash. Long term, airfares will stay about where they are. I can't see a really significant spike in airfares because, you know, to the point I was saying to Jed, if the market bounces back and we do see strong demand and airlines do collapse, others will fill that gap. The barriers to entry are so low now.
Cool.
The thing about that, though, John, to some degree, I was going to say, we have a pandemic here, but we also have an economic crisis as well. So many people have lost their jobs, so many people are out of work. So there's going to be well, not so much pent-up demand, but pent-up aspiration to travel. That has to be factored into a carrier's thinking as well. It's not going to come back. So do you think there'll be mass discounting like we've seen in previous years? And if so, how long do you think that will last?
Yeah, it will last undoubtedly, Chris, because if you think about it, we're now middle of May, peak Northern Hemisphere travel period is late June through to second week of September. Airlines are sitting with 20% of the bookings, maybe 30% of the bookings they had this time last year. They need to get cash in. You know, we're going to be in a short phase of cash generation. Revenue generation for the airlines is going to be absolutely vital. So we're going to be seeing some stunning fares for the first couple of weeks. And that in itself is going to be a real challenge for airlines and revenue management, because traditionally, you know, you'd sell all of your cheap fares in 6 months, 9 months out, and 2 weeks before travel, you'd be looking to sell to a businessman at 4, 5, 6 times what the leisure passenger was paying. The leisure passenger, because of all of these restrictions and all of these uncertainties, isn't going to be booking until 2 weeks before travel, when they feel comfortable enough looking forward that there is still going to be, you know, no restrictions in place. So we're going to be seeing a clash of the leisure booking profile shortening against the business. So from an airline's perspective and from a hotelier's perspective, revenue managing your stock is going to become a little bit more complex for the next couple of months.
Lots of questions about the future specifically of LCCs, and even one from Tony Hallwood asking about whether this is a time to start up a new LCC given aircraft lease rates and oil prices.
Oh, Hallwood Air, I can see it now. Yeah, as I say, this is, you know, bizarrely, for anyone who's, if you bet on the market and you got it right, and you've got lots of cash, now's the time to start an airline. Plenty of slots at Gatwick. You know, you don't have to go to Stansted. There's, you know, lots of opportunity around the world for low-cost airlines. If you get the business model right, you know, and you don't have those pensions, those built-up costs, all of those overheads, and you've got flexible working conditions for your staff and all of these sort of things, and there's a lot of qualified pilots who are going to be looking for jobs in the next couple of months. Now's the time to go for it. There's enough gaps in the market that could be filled.
Watch this space.
Yeah.
I'm conscious of time. We're up to an hour and a half now, and I think we should start to wrap things up if that's okay with everybody. But some great questions. We've had loads of great questions coming in, and I think we got through most of them there, most of the big issues. So
yeah, there was a lot of overlap in the questions looking through the
Yeah.
detail, Jed. So you're not trying to do that and MC, but yeah, I think we will. There was a lot of. I pretty much think we've covered all the key questions.
Good.
Good.
Super. So, well, look, John, thanks a million for your time today. Thanks a million for sharing your insights. Yeah, the gremlins were out, but it was great. We, we all gained a huge amount from that. So thank you very much for that.
Thanks.
Right. Good to see you.
Good seeing you, John. Thanks. And thanks to all of our audience for the fantastic questions as well. Really appreciated all of your questions. Hopefully we got through most of those for you. As we said, we'll be posting the webinar up online in the WeTac group pages on LinkedIn and Facebook later this evening. And please, don't forget to join us for the 8th episode in this series, which will be this Thursday, where we'll hear from Tammy Marshall, who's the CEO of Beehive, who'll be talking to us about crisis and innovation. So do join us same time on Thursday, as it has been throughout the whole series. I guess I'll hand over now to Chris Flynn, our president of WeTac, to provide us with his closing remarks, if you will, Chris.
Well, I just found that a really fascinating session. I took a huge amount from what John was saying, but of course, one of the things that we have to consider is there's just so much confusion out there that it's going to take a while for things to settle and for us to get a clear direction. And until we get that clear direction, it's going to be very, very confusing for our future travelers. It's quite interesting that Dale Lawrence, who posed the question earlier, mentioned that the last time I was on a platform, on a stage with John, was in Auckland a few years ago. And the most contentious issue we were talking about then was, would the A380 survive? And of course, we knew it wouldn't, sadly. That looks like Disneyland compared to what we're actually having to deal with now. So I thought that was a really insightful episode. I thank John for his insights on all of that. I'd also like to thank at this point all our members for supporting us, all our followers, and all those others who are supporting what we're doing. And on that note, I look forward to Thursday's session, which again should be fascinating, with Tammy Marshall. And I hope you can all join us then. Back to you, Jed.
Thanks a million, Chris. So that's it. That's it for us for today. Thanks a million again for all of you, your attendance and your great questions. The series has been hosted by me, Jed Brown of Low Season Traveller, and the producer is Carolyn Childs of My Travel Research. Have a great day, have a great evening, and see you all on Thursday.